Hello everyone, today we talk about the waning of the so-called feudal warfare, a contentious enough term that especially structuralists first over-relied on, then they began to misconstrue because there isn't such a thing as the categorically meant feudal politics or institution or society. Frankly, that's a debate that I'm not very interested in. Feudalism is one of those words, just like, Byzantine, etc., that not only exist for a reason, but quite beautifully captured the essence of something much bigger that encompasses, if anything, the entire historiographical critique of the same terms at the same time, but that still remains, in fact, by the same tools, a useful mean of interpretation of much broader things. Also, in strictly political and social terms, we're not going... We made lots of videos on the topic. Today, we discuss mostly the military side of the story. So aside from the fact that, again, you find those hierarchical exceptions where you have, vassals that were more powerful than kings, etc. That's also part of the military side of the story. But there is sort of more strictly military historiographical criticism to the concept of feudal warfare, which in part blends with those arguments we often criticize ourselves in turn concerning the notion that there would have been this sort of weak, farraginous and inefficient system at a point that equated to backwardness, to some sort of lordly stagnation, the myth of the closed society, and then at some point the infantry is the people, democracy broke out, and guns and infantry and cavalry was defeated, and all that kind of sort of positivistic, technologistic, materialistic BS that frankly we do not really care very much about. As you know, I specialize, for those who don't know, specifically in early 14th century warfare in general. I like cavalry more, but I ended up to research mostly about infantry. It's not like I dislike those, because especially what I study is mostly like the integration of those two arms, not much the infantry victories alone, that in many ways were the product of both a crisis and first of all, an amatorial system that did not really trigger eventually the rise of Renaissance infantry, for example. However, there is also an interesting critique of the mores, right, of the world that was gradually modernizing and secularizing in the later Middle Ages. So, regardless of the almost sinusoidal trend that the cavalry-infantry ratio took it in those times, because, as you know, actually in the mid-14th century, infantry went brutally down again until basically a century later, and cavalry was still dominating, right? And cavalry also came back during the same Renaissance at a point in the latter part compared to infantry. Yes, lots had changed, and it's mostly at least historiographically speaking, a lot is being written. Think about Udzinga, think about Cardini, etc. Probably this sort of moment of passage, like of probably a different in worldview, right? And so the meanings, the original traditional symbols, how these were gradually blurred and blended together with others. And so how, of course, 13th century warfare was not 15th century warfare and not 17th century warfare, because even though cavalry, feudalism, the ancien regime, etc. remained, to a degree they had also within themselves changed lots of their attitudes, of their lifestyle, while still, again, maintaining also at the core the same principles, which should never be forgotten in that regard. So we're not much here to talking about this today. We're talking about more narrower chronological window that is mostly the 13th century itself, right? And there is actually the most potent criticism to the notion of feudal warfare, at least in practical terms, is realizing that what was the origin of this, right? Broadly meant. Essentially, in even the Germanic conquerors of the migration era, when starting to lord over the Romans, did not dismantle the concept of public state, right? The Clovis, as king of the Franks, was literally meant to own the entirety of the people's, even property, in a sense. This obviously is a very contentious concept also for those times, right? The way they would have seen it is that Clovis's imperium was hegemonic over basically all the other Frankish people, so because of those corporative and hierarchical notions of how these people behaved. At the same time, these people were essentially accepted in their own individual imperium, their own lordly autonomy, as much as they objectively had that. So ideally, when the chief, the leader, said, okay, we must do this, all the resources of the system, in theory, all the able-bodied freemen had to take up arms and respond properly to the king's orders. But it was intended just happening by charisma, by inspiration, by the Holy Ghost, that Clovis was the medium with God, etc. Naturally, in more practical terms, Clovis did not actually rule the entirety of the Frankish kingdom in a direct sense. There was no such thing like a centralized state in contemporary terms, even though there were some still statal systems working, especially by Clovis, still by in Clovis times, from the older Roman system was absolutely preserved as long as the Franks themselves could still make it work. But of course, there is a broader civilizational crisis going on. And especially from the second half of the 16th century, there is a full destructuring of the same, even individual monarchic powers. As you know, the Merovingian kingdom or empire better, at some point would split in four. Things happen, and there is a broader privatization, what we call feudalization. And so through the Frankish commendatio, what we call, in more sophisticated terms, if you don't want to use feudalism, because it sounds too brutal sometimes, the vassalatic beneficiary system, right? So the vastus receiving from the senior the beneficium, right? So, and this is the key of the actual, like the core of what feudalism was intended to be, essentially a prepaid military service. The king said, okay, I give you this land, not just because, in a metaphysical sense, I deem you worth of that, because I literally subcontract some part of my own imperium to you, because you deserve that, even though I retain, like, sort of ab origine, so to say, the actual control over it. So I give you literally the means to train yourself, to spend in that. Especially Frankish system was rapidly evolving, as you know, during especially the 8th century. Made lots of videos about that under the early Carolingians rather than the later Merovingians. But the thing had already started since the beginning, really, because where do you draw the line? Also, the Roman system, in some other ways, by different scale, could be seen, right? Definitely not as a contemporary state, something very different, something much more subcontracted, but essentially the prepayment of your military service. I give you land where you can train, you can maintain your war horse, which are enormous expenses, right? And you know that throughout that period, basically cavalry takes over infantry. That still remains, however, possibly victorious in different instances up to basically the second half of the 12th century. So actually the window where cavalry is fully hegemonic, where infantry can't defeat cavalry alone, to put it quite graphically, is just a pretty narrow one, right? It lasted from, in fact, the mid-12th century to the early 14th century. And even though cavalry, as we were saying before, really remained the upper arm, right, until the mid-15th century, and beyond, depending on the system or where we're talking about, in fact, it had only just a couple of centuries, not even, of actual and full predominance on the Western battlefields. And not because infantry is to be understood in an oppositional way in relation to cavalry itself, but because, of course, cavalry and infantry, the overwhelming majority of the times were integrated with one another. Nobody, say, if you had cavalry and infantry to go at war with, unless there was some very strong social issue between the two, and there was never like a classist division between, it mostly were vertical, horizontal divisions overlapping. Obviously, would go at war with cavalry and infantry. The more you are, the more politically united, the stronger you are. And in fact, that's also what feudal historiography, as you know, that is hegemonic in most of, especially Transalpine countries, that are also, in fact, the ones where a civic culture had been feebler throughout the centuries, tend to obscure a bit the role of infantry. For example, in some of the greatest feudal battles of the era, such as we've seen some of them as well, Benevent, Tagliacozzo, Markfeld, these are literally the biggest battles of feudal knights of the 13th century, and in absolute terms, right? The accounts are written mostly by people living in feudal courts with a chivalric ethos, and while we do know, even from the campaign's accounts, that of course infantry was always there, we don't actually grasp what they did during the battle. Maybe just at Benevent we have an idea because Manfred used the Saracens that in part were on foot and they were too exotic not to notice them, but in general, like there were lots of other sort of habitual Western infantry, also in pretty substantially strong fashion, that was there, and that, however, in the battle narratives does not really have a space, right? So if you're interested, by the way, I already made a video about Tagliacozzo, which is not the usual tactical analysis of the battle through the sources, more like the times, and in fact, in that sense, sort of matches a bit we talk about that topic as well. As you know, my master thesis was about the Battle of Markfeld, so at some point we'll make a grand series about that. We still haven't talked about the Battle of Benevent, but again, if you don't know these battles, you literally don't know at least 13th century warfare. Now, aside from this, today we mostly look at those 13th century sort of declining aspects of cavalry, which again would continue to, it's like a Byzantine Empire, like, the Byzantine Empire was doomed to fail or whatever, and it took 1,000 years to fail, right? So indeed there were certain things that were wrong with that, but just in hindsight, considering what we know happened later, that eventually managed to defeat it. Here is a bit like the same thing. And actually the 13th century is still in many cases the very peak of cavalry power and strength. And I'm not really talking just because many channels or other content tend to stress like mostly the technical side of the story, that, as you know, I mostly reject, because we're first of all looking at some condition of symmetry, like cavalry and infantry evolved in parallel in ways that, yes, could have like, again, different in fact, asymmetrical ratios, but that more or less belong to the same material culture. Also, all Western Europeans basically fought in the same way at this point. And especially cavalry was really numerous at this point. Like in the later Middle Ages, indeed, cavalry was tinier, heavier, and truly like that there were also lighter type of cavalry to actually use that, and often men-at-arms dismounted as well. So it's a topic that we already addressed in other videos, always stressing, however, that the primary role of the man-at-arms was to luckily smash into, both mostly other cavalrymen, and that's also why they were so smashing to begin with, and of course also in infantry, which regularly happened, right? Cavalry always charge against literally everything all the time, otherwise it would have not existed. That's all, the only thing that cavalry by definition does, right? If it dismounts, it's not cavalry anymore. Cavalry cannot defend by definition. It's just about smashing, which it does obviously pretty well, and it keeps doing throughout the later centuries as well, regardless of even at the peak, say, of pike and shot warfare during the mid-16th century, when cavalry was reduced to a historical minimum by modern standards. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. So, given this background, let's look at some specific examples that can render a bit the idea of the war. So, towards the close of we can't even talk about the close of a feudal era. For example, I created a feudal warfare playlist that encompasses also most of modern contexts, if they were feudal, say not republican. I'd say the United Provinces were definitely not, a feudal context. But we're talking, 17th century Transylvania. Of course, you can't make the case that that's feudal warfare. But conventionally meant, let's assume for a moment that the 13th century is at least the moment of peak, which is correct, of cavalry. But then from this moment, things started going down and remaining up for a long time, however, before being surpassed by infantry. And of course, there were some dynamics that were already prefiguring at least the disproportionate costs of cavalry to some extent. Remember that whatever we see on the battlefield, if prominently existing and remaining, just like cavalry for the following centuries, is because it worked, and it worked pretty darn well. Right? There isn't such a notion like, this was a mistake, you didn't understand, you can stop cavalry if you want, there is the way. That's not how politics, rather than warfare, works, right? It's mostly, what are we actually talking about? I made a video about the Battle of Courtrai, for example, that is the famous slaughter of the flower of French, in the sense of European knighthood, at the hands of the, almost inept bourgeois of the Flemish cities of Ghent and Brugge. And it's not like during the battle the French weren't, regardless of all the all the ditches, the infantry defense, they weren't actually literally, and they did actually break through the Flemish phalanx, right? Just because the Flemish had, by the way, by knightly advice and direction, because still this infantry army was commanded by the counts, the knights of Flanders, had a reserve had been predisposed to sort of stamp the French from properly ripping the Flemish apart, right? So the notion that, oh my God, that the battle had to go that way because, it's technology, man, if you deploy men, no, right? They actually, the French cavalry proved, regardless of all the other issues that you can't comment, we've seen also in that battle, they had literally broken through the Flemish infantry. That also, in general, was nothing particular. Later, basically, the only Flemish victories here are Courtrai and Montpevel, and Montpevel is a so-so. It's like a draw with the French. Up to Guinegate, at the end of the 15th century, the same identical Flemish armies that do not change an inch, if not for artillery that eventually also didn't help, are exclusively and completely defeated in a painful string of battles by the same Franco-Burgundian armies, using the men-at-arms and horseback cavalry smashing into these guys. And so the notion that here, the bourgeois had found the way to stop cavalry is as a pile of BS. Unfortunately, this is also still propaganda to be. In any case, moral forces are also very important. It's not like I want to diminish the Flemish, the Flemish rank and file infantrymen that definitely proved themselves in that battle, but unitly in the others, were also defeated. So you must understand that the very tiny balance that these battle odds really present us with. So the most important thing, or at least the privileged way to study this, is, of course, at the administrative level. How had, in theory, feudal armies levied, and how things had really changed. So remember what I said before about the prepaid military system. The notion is, I give you that land, and you have to provide military service in theory for free. The most evident proof that feudalism, aka vassalic beneficiary system, had never worked, and that cavalry developed anyway, or in spite of that, exactly because there wasn't that greater grip on, probably greater command on these people. Otherwise, the public authority would have never forfeited this estate to begin with. That was the measure of that public power shortcoming, right? And how society was balanced was in fact quite of a different story, and there is in fact a broader moral temper there to understand why, say, in the early Middle Ages the world came to be like that. And again, as you know, in Schwerpunkt I talked a lot about this. The notion in the sense that there should have been some free service at that point because it was already prepaid by public authority. Of course, those knights wouldn't largely obey to public authorities anymore. This is very obvious in the 10th century. Then gradually, like in the 11th, the 12th, and also the 13th, the so-called feudal monarchies that had emerged from the same system, like compacting more sort of direct control, still through this privatistic organization, rose as greater powers to essentially at least convince other knights to serve. How? Essentially not by asking much the feudal levy anymore for free, but actually negotiating it in exchange for paying. So there were always some knights that served out of loyalty, out of their own duty, because of course the commendatio, properly the investiture of the benefits was a very solemn occasion, exactly because much as it was expected actually to be really fulfilled to some extent of lawlessness and general lack of central power, right? And so they tried to make up for it with those more spiritual and noble means. But indeed, this could happen, a free service could happen because, say, if you were the vassal that inhabited those lands where the enemy was invading, it's not like you need, in order to make an affront to the king because you didn't want him to gain more power, you would not go to war against, aside the royal army, just because you prefer the enemy to walk into your home, right? But for the rest, there were very precise and strict limits to that. I made multiple videos, if you're interested, probably about the salaries, like probably the conditions of payment during 13th century, essentially knightly warfare, because again, in Western warfare, this is when, again, cavalry reaches its peak and there is the great explosion of chivalry, etc. And so, if we look really at the end of the so-called feudal era, if we assume that for some reason the later Middle Ages is something slightly different, as it was indeed, only a small, let's say, within the mounted forces within a feudal army comprised only a small number of true knights, right? That is, individuals serving in return for knights' fiefs. Knighthood can, of course, be attributed especially to, because the term often is used as vague, like men-at-arms would be perhaps proper, but, knighthood had fundamentally stratified towards, especially like the third quarter of the 12th century, there is a much more neatly outlined higher nobility, and then the lesser aristocracy that basically perform similar roles. During the 13th century, there is actually a great homogenization of knightly panoply. And even for the retinues, like the poor beggar squire following the heavily armored master is not quite there anymore. There are the roles are similar, but basically even the lesser elements look pretty well armored, right? And although there is definitely still some certification, the system is much more homogeneous, compact, it's much more monetized, uniformed. This is the peak property of universal powers, and so we see massive armies that had conferred, even just by themselves, like this enormous military experience to anyone participating to them. So great collective training, very advanced moment in the history of warfare. The same goes for infantry, for that matter, supported knight most of the time. But numerically speaking, the cavalry was predominantly made up of non-knightly individuals holding knights' fiefs, either those awaiting knighthood or those unwilling or financially unable to accept it, which means even newly enriched people that, however, participated just by law, sometimes like to the army. The richer you were, the more you had to participate. I mean, there is a long history of that. It was basically true in every Romano-Germanic levy. And this was still true in feudal times, even though there was at this point a bit more of a difference between noblemen and non-noblemen regarding the various estates privileges. In, say, the Italian communes, the city-state basically said if you are rich enough to maintain a war horse, you have to go at war with that. And at large, in the sort of still moment of rise of the great medieval civilization up to the peak that we're discussing now, people would be very incentivized to pass from, I don't know, a mercantile lifestyle to a military one. It had always been blurred to an extent, but I mean, it's only later that military duty seemed like, okay, it's too much. Now the moral forces of Eurasian civilization were going down, and people tried to pay others, aka mercenaries or foreigners, as we documented very well, for example, for the 14th century, to go fight in their stead. Right, which in part already happened, in fact, starting from this view. We talked about, for example, the cavallata system that is very well documented in Florence. And you could, if you had the money for maintaining a war horse, you could pick a guy, which was usually a volunteer, right, to go fight in your stead. You put the money, the guy put his life, right? And so that was actually quite convenient. Others militating in this say so-called generically meant knightly ranks, because at this point being a knight again is mostly like a very certified nobiliar status at an institutional and juridical level. Temporary retainers hired in exchange for monetary fiefs, so this is basically the feudal equivalent of what we just described in Italian city-states. Landless members of knightly families that, of course, had that vocation in their blood, but they didn't know where to get. These people would always constitute, since the beginning, also in later time, a pretty consistent amount of sort of knightly, also later, more also soldierly professional troops. Feudal tenants of lower than knightly ranks, such as the sergeants, and I made 2 videos about the sergeants and the crusader sergeants. They're basically the same thing, but at least there is some slight divide. So we're still squires and already paid stipendiaries that really constituted an increasing amount of force that would essentially to take over, because the stipendiaries were not normally different people from the ones that we already described. You can't divide them by status, by income, by contract, and mostly the latter would, as you know, substitute, think about the indenture, the condotta, etc., the actual hiring system, like the conditions under which they had to serve, etc. The reality that many who held what were once knights' fiefs were no longer technically knights prompted by the 13th century, a shift toward using the value of personal possessions rather than land ownership as the criterion for mandatory military service. Also because, of course, this society was, especially from the mid-12th century, overbearingly affluent, right? And there were unprecedentedly large means of income that for the previous centuries would have been completely insane. Actually, this is, if you think about the Brabant songs in the 12th century, you realize that thing had already been escalating from some while. I made, by the way, a video about medieval mercenaries from the 8th to the 12th century. That is a bit like the prehistory of that, mostly because we hardly have any contract, etc. Even, I don't know, things like the indenture, the condotta did not really emerge from a day to another. That these were always the normal contracts that troops brought to fight in a war or another signed or swore to, and just like the level of literary practice that sort of increased, at least for us to have enough sources to document the contract itself, preserved, archived, and so on. But the aforementioned change ensured that essentially those who could afford the necessary horse and the increasingly complex and costly knight armor would serve. Right, I have an entire series in, especially you can. I don't remember if there is a series about medieval knighthood, but it's not just about the military historical units, where we literally make a video about every single type, like say 10 day. I wish 10 days. Say 10 years at a distance of every type of armor that we see in Western Europe to say, okay, that's how it evolved. And you know that the 13th century essentially witnesses gradually introduction of plate armor for the body, for the torso, for the limbs, because at large, actually, helmets had always been plate armor of some sort, and also mostly the increase probably in hardware. Like it's ever more frequent to see more layers of armor that had already been a thing in the past, but less sustainable. The horse barding fully appears, like in Western sources at least, in an unequivocal way, and it was an ultra elite, like 1/10 of the knights at most in most affluent contexts. And so everything becomes heavier, more technical. This is also what gradually drives away people from the exercise of arms, because fighting like this required, it's not just a great physique and athleticism, but properly a lifestyle increasingly dedicated to that effort, right? So that's different from even the much more sort of individually performing, 6th century Anglo-Saxon warrior, right? That surely made a much greater effort, even in relative terms, to his, however, looser equipment. This starts becoming like the equivalent, say, of a war horse, like military panoply for knight, etc., is the equivalent of having a private jet today, societally speaking. So you understand how traumatically expensive this was, and remember that at this point it still was the most efficient way, given the general moral and societal balance of the situation. We'll talk more about those moral aspects at a point, but this was the norm. It wasn't inefficient. It wasn't like there wasn't a moment after this in which people began to say, oh my God, this is unsustainable, we can't fight with cavalry. But absolutely not, all right? Simultaneously, this dynamic led to a significant decrease in the size of knightly contingents, at least properly the picked ones across most European armies. Here we are a bit later in time. It's mostly the 14th century. But we have a striking example, at least, of the strains that this could put in theory, not just as a demand, but let's say for how society was organizing itself otherwise. With the English Baron Hugh de Courtenay, whose required contribution during Edward I's reign plummeted from 92 knights based on his estates, that lording over he had, which he had to gain troops from, to a mere 3, right? And this could happen for many reasons, but remember that in these, especially towards the later, here we are, I made, as you know, multiple videos about Edward I. That is one of my favorite rulers in absolute terms. And this is already a descending phase, the beginning of stagnation of the system, where basically much was being socioeconomically eroded from the bottom up. So in general, even if a nobiliary crisis could occur, as we said before, with a higher nobility, there were ever fewer people, and the others sort of impoverishing themselves, and also people working for them, maintaining them. All the peasants essentially worked mostly just for this kind of military, for providing this military resources, began to impoverish themselves to an important degree. I made a video about 13th century English peasantry conditions that were actually very harsh, harsher than, say, most Western ones, as a matter of fact. So in a sense, it speaks of these drastic reductions of, say, from the nominal to the actual. This is, however, completely normal also in the previous centuries. If you read, for example, from different sources like the Essays of Armies, for how we can know about the rest of society, for, again, France, Sicily, whichever monarchy we have this information for, in theory, these kingdoms alone could field, I think, even tens of thousands of knights. And a large part of these were actually active, locally speaking, so out of control, the direct control of the monarchy, But of course, the possibility of levying them, for example, a major regional clash, was practically impossible. Just a fraction of that were at most available. And we're talking, as you know, mostly about a few thousands, with tens of thousands of infantry at the largest. I made recently a video about at least how the Italian communes defied a bit this material limits to at least the degree, of course, which they were embarrassingly wealthy, but they're not all. Now, this drastic reduction in the available knights reflects the broader economic pressures and evolving military obligations. Because it's not like those knights could have not been found, say, embroiled, actually serving somebody else. But the original feudal levy was basically broken as far as that was concerned. It was objectively easier, again, to have a monarchy, as we were saying before, just paying for random knights that would have arrived from elsewhere as well. This is notorious, just by the errant nature of knights in general. We've seen it for the Byzantines or other powers. The Hungarians did that very much with lots of Western knights and more. But we can witness the decline of this strictly older feudal mechanism by the detailed records in the English pipe rolls and chancery documents, which show the constant decline in knightly service obligations, which again doesn't mean there weren't actually less knights for the English army to hire, but in fact not to levy in the old way, across multiple baronies. We're in the late 13th century, with some estates reporting to up a 70% reduction in knightly quotas between 1270 and 1300. These last decades of the 13th century are already, again, have surpassed the peak, or at least there is still this momentum, especially in wealth, but in terms of that it is accumulating, but in moral forces, the system is beginning to stagnate and contracting. And so all that enormous feudal push that, however, had civilizationally been the deal in the previous generations was now beginning to slow down. For instance, the wardrobe accounts of Edward I revealed that by 1297, baronial summonses for campaigns in Gascony and Scotland frequently yielded only 10-20% of the expectedly knightly levies, which is interesting because they were also more primitive places. So in a sense, it was easier there because there was less of a state there to hire people, and so the general levy was sort of more expected. France, England, other more updated powers instead had more money just because they had a better state with greater central power, and they could simply hire them. And so they simply dismissed the practice of feudal levying, even though that still, on paper, still existed. In any case, even in, for example, Scotland and Gascony are, at least Scotland will have its moment of rise, but in a decentralized situation, Gascony also was not really a powerhouse. And so you see in these places many barons citing financial exhaustion or redirecting obligations through scutage payments, further corroborated by the Liber Quotidianus Contra Rotulatores Garderobe, which is yet another interesting source of the era. Think about the Scottish armies. They weren't strong for cavalry, right? They had lots of infantry, not even because their infantry was more than matched, but because literally was too few surplus in Scotland for having a sort of at least a dignified knightly force at the same scale of the English. So even there, nothing like a special Kabbalistic calculation of how many knights, how many infantry you need to do it. It's about moral forces, guys. Right? In that case, the poor, primitive, backwards, and not even feudal Scotland managed to win its independence against the much more. Additionally, the close rolls of 1296-1302 document specific instances where tenants-in-chief negotiated reduced quotas, such as the case of Roger de Maurbray, whose obligation dropped from 60 to 12 knights due to debts incurred from prior campaigns, by the way, highlighting the fiscal strain on the feudal elite. This was also a way to make things just more efficient to begin with, aside from the cost of course, that was the major aspect here. But say, if I have, say, less knights but better armed, this was the original rota system, the concept that, one guy actually goes toward the fittest one, goes toward the others pay for him. Things get gradually better in a moment of increased professionalization of the elite, and still relative abundance here, because again, if you put together all these various lords, forces in a kingdom, they still can provide like a crushing force for the most affluent court. We are really witnessing to a functional, very advanced and fluidifying system as well. This trend is further illustrated by the 1298 master rolls for the Falkirk campaign, which indicate that only 7% of summoned knights appeared in person, with the majority either paying scutage or sending substitutes, as detailed in the Scottish rolls of the Exchequer. Moreover, the Inquisition's post-mortem for the period revealed that many knightly estates were fragmented through inheritance, reducing the economic capacity of their heirs to fulfill traditional quotas individually, right? With some holdings valued at less than £20 annually, insufficient to maintain even a single fully equipped knight. It's evident that it was easier at that point just to cash money and then hire some professional that already wandered as a knight for a hire, for a living. Several other factors contributed, of course, to this situation. And the result is just how everything was compounded in this dynamic. As noted earlier, the rising costs of horses and armor meant that fewer individuals could afford to become knights, because the heavier the panoply, the more robust the horse, by the way. So the bigger, the most expensive, and so on. And even those who could often lack the resources or desire to support large groups of similarly equipped fighters, there was a general pacification carried out by the monarchies at the time, whereby, let's say, war was always like a publicly legalized system where you couldn't simply go out to war for your own private feuds like the mob back in the day, right? So everything is much more carefully handled from the top, also in a more efficient way. For instance, the cost of a fully equipped war horse could exceed £100 by the late 13th century, equivalent to several years' income for a minor landholder, while a full suit of plate armor, increasingly necessary due to advancements in weaponry, could cost upwards of £20, as documented in contemporary armor guild records from Paris and London. So imagine like years of work of an average farmer like being destroyed like in a single battle, right? And think also all the minor engagements that we often discuss that historiography does not focus on, as if all the Middle Ages were just sieges or rarer, larger pitch battles, right? There was actually a lot of fighting in between in open fields that required also that cavalry fitness, and where in fact troops would gain also most of their factual experience. Now, these costs were exacerbated by the need for specialized equipment such as reinforced saddles and chainmail barding 4 horses, which could add another £10-15 per night, according to inventories from the Arsenal of Venice and the Tower of London Armories. I made, as you know, multiple videos about both the Venetian and the English armies organization at this point. And by the way, it's not like the system was making less war. Of course, as civilization advances, the greater its destructive power is. And as a matter of fact, like, war was escalating, was ever more efficient, destructive, and, really needing more means to preserve, to consolidate power that would benefit, in fact, the various powers that managed to stand on their feet at this point. Because remember, the system had emerged from a much more fragmented reality, and so whoever rose to the top here is to particularly combat also because of their military capacity. Moreover, the rising popularity of tournaments as a social and martial institution further strained knightly finances. We've seen it in multiple videos about tournaments that I made, especially last year. I'm really glad we have several episodes in the relative playlist. As participants often required multiple sets of armor and horses. This was the same for actual combat. Actually, as you know, in the previous centuries in particular, tournaments were identical to battles, meaning that there was literally no difference whatsoever. There were actual battles. But the system needed this for the fitness, the quality, especially the collective training of the knights. We're talking, sometimes like a single sets of armor and horses costing an additional £50 per event, tournaments-wise, as noted in the household accounts of the Earl of Warwick in 1284 to maintain status and meet the expectations of chivalric culture. The financial burden was compounded by the need to maintain retinues for tournament circuits, with records from the Tournai chroniclers Gilles Musi in 1300 estimating that a single tournament season could cost a knight upwards of £200, including travel, lodging, and ceremonial expenses. In all this considered, you have to feed your horse. That requires very pure water, very specific proportions of grass and fodder, etc. So it's a constant, it's a full professional living that lasts literally for the existence of the individuals. We know of guys engaging in tournaments in Austria in their 80s, rather than their same period. The economic pressure was further intensified by the increasing taxation, of course, imposed by monarchs to fund ongoing wars, which was, as we've seen, the substitutive mean to solve the matter to begin with. We're making a lot of English examples here. We have Edward I's levies of 1294-1297 showing this, extracting up to a tenth of movable property from lay estates, which is a lot for medieval standards, as recorded in the lay subsidy rolls, pushing many minor knights into debt or forcing them to sell land to meet both fiscal and military obligations. This tells you, by the way, why many of them would become mercenaries themselves at this point, because they wouldn't have so easy to simply live off their own estates, which we're talking about 13th century noblemen, so just think about it. Additionally, the widespread practice of paying scutage and the frequent granting of special exemptions either eliminated or substantially reduced the mandatory service obligations of many. As you know, throughout the later Middle Ages, the early modern age, most of the aristocrats' life in that sense was having your own estates and integrating the revenues of that with pay, with the subcontraction, especially in the Renaissance, as you know, of the command of specific units from the king and so on, so that you could compound both income, right? You would have this basis, especially again, for getting the basic gear and the general background, having been raised a nobleman, etc. But then you had to make money outside, because it's not like the system in itself was competitive anymore. You lived into a state that overall protected you in exchange for this taxation. And if you wanted to have sort of a higher place in society, in the higher, of course, at that point, at high levels to command, etc., you had to go to war through the channels that were appearing at that point. It's not like before things were better, right? Let's debunk this mythology that, before, like, the individual had it better. I mean, contemporarily speaking, that you measure comfort basically as the degree of lifestyle. For some reason, for some superstition, like the fact that before state things were better, absolutely not. They were disproportionately worse. If anything, morally, they could have been better for the individual to live more intensely, living, loving, killing better than we do. But not because the system was better at all, but because in that sense the burden was all on the individual. So if you were a knight living just 200 years before, you would routinely go out there errand to make fortune. Like, watch that video about the Earldom of Ulster and see what the Anglo-Norman knights did there since quite a while. Again, we were talking about it in that video about sort of high medieval mercenarism. And it was an incredibly miserable life, even as an aristocrat, even as a person who had it far better than most other people working for them, by the way, because that's mostly all what the system was about. Now, scutage, a monetary payment in lieu of military service, became increasingly common, with rates in England rising from approximately £1 per knight's fee in the early 13th century to 2 or more by the 90s of the same, as recorded in the exchequer accounts, reflecting both inflation and the crown's preference for cash to hire professional soldiers. They would essentially pay for somebody else to pay in your stead. In France, similar trends are evident in the royal ordinances of Philip IV. They also had these great issues at large. I made multiple videos about the French military organization of the period, the fact that this leviathan that the Capetian monarchy had become, like with a massive state, etc., mostly presented with issues of fluidification of the previous feudal system where it had sprung from. And true, in fact, a gradual monetarization of the service, and that had to mostly also go in parallel with the establishment of central institutions capable of hopefully uniforming this enormous number of knights from countries that were even technically not France. If you think about Occitania, the crown lands over there, and beyond. Philip III, by 1294, allowed tenants in chief to commute service for payments averaging 100 livres tournois per knight's fee, enabling the crown to fund professional armies for campaigns like the Flemish Wars. And as we were saying before, if you look at Courtrai, aside from the disaster, you realize that those French men were quite militarily competent and coming very close to victory. The French Livre de Métier from 1290 also records exemptions granted to urban militias in exchange for fixed payments, further illustrating the monetization of military obligations across Europe. For example, the city of Brugge, that we mentioned before, also during the Flemish Revolt, contributed 10,000 livres in 1297 to support Philip IV's campaign, which is also a reason why it rebelled later. This is noted in municipal records, effectively replacing feudal levies with civic funding. In the Holy Roman Empire, similar patterns emerged with the 1222 Reichssteuerregister showing cities like Cologne, the biggest city in Germany, paying hump sums to avoid knightly service. This is similar again to what we were saying before, given talking cities here about the same Italian ones. They were the largest together with these, also with Paris, with London. In fact, we have quite, aside from, whether they are feudal capitals or not, capitals of large feudal kingdoms, but the urban environment has this higher literacy and therefore also documentary production. We can see more. And obviously, by the way, this was the Archbishopric of Cologne. I made a video recently about the three major Rhenish archbishoprics in Germany, the three ecclesiastical electors, and of course, where was this this resource redirected? Well, of course, towards mercenary recruitment, right? And if you're interested in this stuff, you can check out my German Ministeriales playlist. The decline in available feudal troops was largely counterbalanced by, as you have understood by now, corresponding rise in the use of stipendiaries and mercenaries, which is the same thing. There are just different terminologies for using them, who were typically more dependable, better trained, because they were tendentially professional, more effectively led as a consequence as well, and available for service throughout the year. Right, if you're interested in the next step to this, because this is the 13th century. For the 14th century, the free companies, you know them. I made pretty hefty video about them just recently, so you can check that out. Moreover, by the late 13th century, many knights, despite still being bound by feudal duties, also received payment, which often enabled them to supply larger contingents than they would have under a strictly feudal arrangement and potentially for extended periods. By the 14th century, terms of service were typically formalized in advance through written contracts. That's a bit the peak of essentially at least the army's size and development, organization, administration behind them. These indentures, and since we're making mostly English examples here, such as those preserved in the English Public Record Office for Edward III's campaigns, in a moment in which the English army was very professional, right? This is just like, in fact, the following century. Often specified daily wages, for example, 2 shillings for a knight, 1 shilling for an esquire, and included clauses for compensation for lost horses. This was also a very old thing. Mostly, as we've seen, a war horse was incredibly expensive. And if crippled, obviously there was a lot to lose from that. There were major scams revolving also around the idea, oh, my horse was crippled here, let's just to cash further money, etc. So there was also strict policing on this stuff. This really was just the implementation of professionalization of military service. Again, these things had always existed, but now they were better regulated, better documented. We can know more about them. More systematized at a bigger scale. Just by comparison, but we're going far from at least what would have been mostly the 13th century. As the next stage, the indenture of Sir John Hawkwood with Florence in 1375. We never made a video about Sir John Hawkwood, but we talked about him obviously in the Free Companies video because he deserves much more than that all by himself. But in 1375, this indenture stipulated payments for 50 lances and 40 florins per month. This would be a condotta, by the way, alongside provisions for equipment maintenance, illustrating the sophisticated contractual frameworks that emerged to support mixed feudal mercenary forces across Italy and beyond. Similarly, and we've seen this also in some detail, and that is a bit like the beginning of free companies to an important extent by size, the Catalan companies' contracts with the Byzantine Empire in 1303, as recorded by the famous chronicler Ramon Muntaner, writing within the context of the court of the kings of Aragon, offering annual salaries of 4 ounces of gold per cavalryman, demonstrating the global spread of mercenary systems and their reliance on detailed agreements to ensure loyalty and performance. And you can see where Roger de Flor had emerged from with that. It's a very interesting context, from the siege of Acre to the wars of the Vespers, to in fact the Byzantine Empire against the Turks and more. I also made a video about the army organization of the Duchies of Athens and Neopatras that are sort of the territorial consequences of that. The increasing sophistication of these contracts is further evidenced by 1347 indenture of the Earl of Northampton, which included provisions for loot distribution and prisoner ransoms, ensuring that mercenary contingents were incentivized to remain in service for extended campaigns, which was also the other vexata quaestio of the feudal levies that had just, 40 days normally by the 13th century of service, and that it would actually even exceed, but against payment. And so that was the political limitation, if anything, to that. So when you start having enough money and you have soldiers that are taking this money but evidently getting this from a source that is more likely to hire them again, because this is not permanent yet. It's something between already. Actually, the mid-14th century starts that, but becomes virtually permanent in this period. Well, if you stay for longer during the campaign, which is not like just an overwhelming risk, especially for a man-at-arms that at this point he's probably the backbone of these armies. I mean, it's a bloody, risky, violent business, but let's say not to the extent of adding some other days, right? For some would be lethal actually, but in the bigger picture, this is more convenient, at least in front of the fact that you would be continuously rehired, right? And we discussed this not just for during the 100 Years' War. We find lots of this also from the English side, the French side, but I made lots of videos, especially in fact about the latter, the famous ordinances. And it's something that was basically already happening elsewhere. And again, unfortunately, modernists that study this stuff from, say, what they think is the beginning, so the mid-14th century, in fact, spot this period just because they find documents, right? But they refuse to understand that medieval warfare had come to that from quite a long time, actually. And so the things happen even if they're not registered properly. And sometimes, literally, like there are some places where archives went destroyed, and nobody suspects that it could be the same identical thing because, say, we have just narrative sources for that. But if you look at the armies, unlike these people really do, because they don't study campaigns and battles, you realize that with that level of cohesion, it would have had pretty much the same, even if it's not documented. Also, for some, it was documented at the time, but things went lost for us. So it's very subjectivistically idiotic posture that I will not say from which side of the aisle. I already said it before, but the modern era is a scam, right? It's a massive academic scam. It did not exist. It's complete nonsense. There's just Middle Ages in contemporary years. In any case, as we were pointing out, there are plenty of examples. For example, the rise of the condottieri in Italy is documented in 1363, but they already exist. The condottas existed since the 13th century, right? And again, in that sense, because we find a term that in vernacular is condotta, but it's not like these contracts did not exist before, right? They would have been written in Latin anyway, but the term just appears there. So that's where the condottas appeared. But, if you have a, broader knowledge of military institutions across the art of war, you know that they already existed. The masnata is the same thing, right? Anyway, and so when you look at the, for example, 1363 contract of Albert Sterz, these are the aforementioned German mercenaries, typical the era with Siena, right? And I made a video about medieval Siena, by the way, introduced performance-based bonuses such as 10% of captured territories revenue, further aligning mercenary incentives with employer objectives and solidifying the shift towards professionalized warfare. Another commonly noted factor in the military decline of the feudal knight was the increasing significance of infantry, which had developed a greater capacity to resist the charges of armored cavalry. This is true to especially the extent that in the first half of the 14th century, as the Flemish, the Scots, the Swiss, and other players, including the English, by the way, but that under a monarchic and mostly dismounted force rather than else. And I don't know, we talk about the Dittmarscher, there are a bunch like across Europe, but not in the mainstream places. Like it's not like, I don't know, infantries were very strong in places like Italy, for example. It's not that they took over because, as we said at the beginning of the video, you actually want to fight with both if you have that, right? As we've seen, Scotland had less cavalry because it was poorer. The Flemish rebelled because they literally did so as estates of bourgeois that largely fought on foot. The Swiss mostly ambushed as peasants, right? And the saying goes for the Dittmarscher, etc. But again, if you look at the more advanced military systems in France, in Italy, in Spain, to an extent, you realize, and England, for example, is one of those that decides to fight with what? With, who are these dismounted guys? Actually, they're actually dismounted guys that did not go a war without horse. They simply dismounted for. I made so many videos, as you know now, about the English tactics of the 100 Years' War, and so that actually loaded the conventional infantry, right, and shows you that the most advanced military systems actually did not really abandon infantry, and those victories are somehow an accident, as marvelous and stunning from the chroniclers of the era. We talked about Courtrai before, that's one of the cases. But they're not definitive. They're not really putting an end to the hegemony of cavalry in those very years even, right? So nobody thought of reforming the system in that direction. If anything, we've seen it, especially in the video about the French Army of the 100 Years' War, French Army organization. It was mostly about uniforming, recompacting, spreading more, more extensive discipline all across this enormous armies put together from very different places, rather than, there was something wrong with the tactics there that were also pretty much the same tactics that was used all across Europe, just adapted at some point to the immediate contingencies. The adoption of disciplined infantry formations, when you look at, I don't know, again, the Flemish infantry we talked about, they weren't actually very disciplined, to tell the truth, but when you look at later Swiss pike squares, those were more disciplined. Combining different combined arms tactics capable of, for example, penetrating with their weapons the most advanced plate armor at a substantial distance, you realize that something does change that apparently cripples at least this aura that cavalry had maintained pretty much unscathed for quite a long time. That nobody could remember in the, say, generationally speaking at that point, having existed. But it was, of course, like the process also a broader mounting process, because even if infantry could beat cavalry up to, again, the 12th century, cavalry was still stronger, so they won most of the time, still from quite a long time, right, from basically 700 years. It's obvious, however, that there was a shift also in the broader wake of modernization and secularization that always accompanies the development of humanity. We talked this in different topics, even if you look at the history of chivalry itself, that to this channel is actually very central in many ways. We can notice how standards change for everybody involved. Like, people think it mostly, again, materially or technically, like say, cavalry at some point became obsolete. Why don't you actually see it as, first of all, as it happened, the nobility remained always in charge until the 18th to 19th century, or even the beginning of the 20th. So if we really want to be precise in formal academic terms, the Ancien regime is just the triumph of the nobility over anybody else in the later Middle Ages, including the Renaissance, that for some maybe strange modernistic, progressistic propaganda has been passed, that the freeing of the individual. People were, in relative terms, were actually much freer, say, in the 13th century than in the 17th, for that matter. But the most interesting thing is seeing, in fact, how things changed for this chivalric order and for also the rest of the people. In fact, when you actually see that infantry acquires greater importance in later medieval times, as we said, it's not like people increased more in importance in late medieval times. If anything, there is a collapse of probably the sheer scale of infantry by the mid-14th century. And if infantry is more useful, it's because it's also smaller but better, and those who pay for it are the same noblemen, together with their own cavalry and sort of knightly force. And again, it all across most of Europe, actually, the feudal system, as feudal warfare, as we were saying before, actually remains standing for, again, literally until 1 or 2 centuries ago. And most people literally lack this knowledge. Like, they think, again, that there was, like, the scientific revolution and everything. It's a completely narrow scientific and technologistic delusion. By the way, completely disproven by the fact that basically all that happened in the 18th century was already there in the 17th. For not saying that you could do the same philosophically, culturally, etc. Like, we all know, we've seen also in 18th century warfare how primitive and rudimentary actually linear tactics really were, and how much there isn't much of an enormous change even in the essence of, say, company combat straightforwardly up to that point. Like, the battlefield becomes empty only when machine guns basically come around, right? That's a deep change. But aside from that, as you know, Schwerpunkt deals in severe depth with most of all these topics. So at some point we will get somewhere, of course, where we wanna be. So military treatises, of course, of the later centuries, such as those by the Italian condottieri, and we're talking very late time because treatises are also something very Renaissance-like, further emphasize the growing reliance, of course, on coordinated infantry tactics to counter cavalry, for example. This would have actually existed already before. It's not like in the 13th century, since cavalry was stronger, infantry said, okay, so every time we're charged by cavalry, we don't have to fight. This defies the fundamental principle of combined arms, and we have so many battles that illustrate this. For example, the battles of the Lombard League era, right? You find their infantry resisting. Also because if they didn't do that, they would have been cut to pieces, and that saved their lives sometimes because cavalry had time, for example, to reform or reinforcements to arrive. There are certain levels of infantry power, say in the second half of 13th century Italy, like at Fossalta, for example, by the Bolognese, that is really shocking. I recently made a video, by the way, about the medieval infantry autonomy, roughly around, I think it was between the mid 12th, the end of the 12th, the beginning of the 14th century. So we're exactly in that chronological window. And you can see how tough cavalry, infantry actually was, also cavalry, of course. In fact, another thing that modernism may have actually polluted in brutal ways is the notion that infantry was stronger in Renaissance than in the Middle Ages. And in some cases, of course, this is not in relative terms, this is true, provided that there were always princely armies by people who didn't have anything to organize themselves at large and pike and square formations. So it's always states that do that. In the 13th century, actually, you have more autonomous polities. So if people are so obsessed about liberty at least in an anti-monarchic sense, where they can't look even at greater examples, but actual armies, and I made a video just the other day, in, say, the early 14th century were massive, much bigger, actually, than most Renaissance armies of the same. If you look at the Swiss, do you think that the Swiss in the Renaissance had bigger armies than, say, I don't know, what the Italians had during the first half of the 14th century? We're talking big scales, like 3-1. It's something enormous. And we have been completely removed from that notion that the medieval civilization was actually much more powerful than most of the modern one, and that for some reason the entire narrative goes the other way, and simply because people who wrote the history went against tradition, went against the papacy, went against the empire, went against any kind of glue that could keep things together. So they began to exalt against any objective standard, fractally dispersed policies as if they were the heroes of the situation, and denying what was happening also from the other side. Right, we made multiple videos about the alleged accomplishments of the Dutch school after, say, during the 80 Years' War. That, chapeau to Maurice of Nassau with all his successful sieges, but as long as the northern Germans used those also pretty vague notions against Catholic armies during the 30 Years' War, they were beaten in an embarrassing way. And we're talking properly about something else entirely. And in fact, the same Gustavus Adolphus actually had to operate with larger armies and specific, in fact, larger scale tactical interaction, what the Saint Dutch had envisaged. On top of this, financed essentially by French money, because otherwise they would have not had the steam to sustain a war in Germany the way they did. So we're looking really at a very complicated scenario. By the way, I want to come back on 17th century warfare, because that's quite illustrative, especially during the 30 Years' War, of all these changes. And so we shouldn't feel much, especially the mid-14th century, as a progress, nor even the 15th to a larger extent, at least up to the mid-century. The chronicler Jean Froissart, and we made a video about him, describes the effectiveness of the English longbow in Crécy, and as I described in recent videos, of course, the notion that for some reason the longbow was superior to the crossbow is at the very best, an extremely contentious one. Without mentioning that it wasn't the archers that won the battles for that matter. So the notion that volleys would simply decimate French cavalry is purely wishful thinking. We obviously have archaeological evidence from battlefield revealing bodkin points designed to specifically pierce armor, but aside from the fact that this mostly happened at closer range, this stuff already existed since ever, right? There are specific weapons. There is my series about the regional 11th to 14th century warfare across literally all over Eurasia and in Africa that points very well how certain weapons were specifically designed, also with different arrow tips. That has always been the case for any military archery context. Also hunting, for that matter, different types of weapons, just of blades, of tips for different types of targets. That this is incredibly important. When you read the tactical manual of Giovanni de' Medici, written around 1400, the author advocates for combined arms strategies. By that point, of course, integrating different type of arms. That, however, aside from essentially the firearms that had become an important element within the same, handgunners among the broader armies, that are always the same. Pikemen, archers, at most light cavalry is something that, as we said before, was more around in the later Middle Ages to support the ultra heavier cavalry. At this point, was incredibly heavy. But 13th century armies were exactly the same: cavalry, pikemen, and archers, plus other sort of melee troops. But wasn't this always there, right? So as you saw before, let's be extremely careful at simply inflating the feudal system with one that would not be militarily or tactically sophisticated, right? As a matter of fact, everything, as you know, is the product of politics. Again, you could have not had pike squares in the 16th century hadn't you had probably a state that controlled more and the people were more subjected to, right? You could have not really enforced that level of collective discipline. But at the same time, when you read when you realize really what kind of collective discipline 13th, 14th century feudal armies had at having, battle lines of thousands of knights flanked by, at times, literal squares of 5,000 infantrymen that perfectly followed them alliantly to them into combat and constantly cooperate in 3 lines in depth. And how much all this was organized. Hell, again, it's not like you look at a Swiss army of the late 15th century and they have any of that. All right, they have more concentrated collective training as far as pike squares are concerned. But they're also smaller armies, and they're also relatively vulnerable. You need that's why pike and shot tactics were mostly developed later, and you still need cavalry, you still need artillery. You need also the missile element, obviously in the shot. But this is really, I like this kind of topics because sometimes they may seem, I don't know how much people watch this stuff, like the last video about, for example, the aforementioned infantry tactical autonomy was fairly well watched, fairly well liked. But sometimes I repeat this stuff because it seems to me they're deeply misunderstood. And again, I was told once I had a bias in favor of cavalry, or at least about specific, French cavalry in particular. Honestly, it's not like you can't see their debacle, but we're talking about the same France that after 100 Years' War was the most powerful state in Europe, that had the strongest army. Before the Spanish also came around, it were a very feudal system in their own kind. And realized that, of course, the sheer technical side of the story has practically nothing to do with it. It's not technology, it's not different types of, say, of fighting choices. All right, it's not like somebody woke up one day and said, "Okay, well now we can counter cavalry." Infantry had always been there countering cavalry. That's all they did. Combined arms systems. You have infantry, you have cavalry. Mostly they're fighting one against the other, but of course in the mess of battle, pretty interesting things happen on a regular basis. And so it's always a product of politics. It's not a sort of engraved absolute standard that camps in the sky for some reason that people have to get to. Right? It's just how the politics and the society evolve. And I think with the examples I provided before, we're getting there. The adoption of gunpowder weapons, those cost a lot as well. Think about the early hand cannons documented, but these were actually also full artillery in the Florentine archives by 1326. So they were surely an effect that made, if anything, introduced, as we were saying before, another tactical variable, or at least, yes, the handgunners in particular would later, as far as conventional arms, because artillery remained farraginous in the field until relatively late in time. In open field, like aside from against the fortifications. But even that, right, is far away. In 1326, the Florentines used armies of German and French knights taken literally from across the Alps, because they hyper relied on heavy cavalry at that point. So the entire notion there would be a granularly documentable linear increase of cavalry fall, because in the moment in which firearms were rising, it's absolutely non-existent. Like it's a gross mistake. It finds no evidence whatsoever, right? And it would take a long time before artillery could simply be employed to deliver devastating blows. By the way, just to some knights, armored knights at close range, right? And mostly because, people are charging, artillery and artillery shoots at mitraille, that is in theory also not overwhelmingly effective as opposed to falconet shot that, however, you don't necessarily just shoot among cavalry to make much effect, or in the 16th century in the broader tactical picture. Now, the impact of these early firearms is also detailed in, again, chronicles, and there's no doubt. If you read Matteo Villani, was the brother of the famous Giovanni, he described, this is the age, of course, of the free companies in the 100 Years' War, the Battle of Brignais, 1362, when primitive gunpowder weapons were put to good use against cavalry, but definitely not by any stretch of the imagination now artillery bringing down cavalry. It wasn't properly there, all right, as a concept. And again, nobody would have used it if it had been the case, as it happened later at large. Not even, because again, in the 18th century, cavalry has come back on the field. So even the most sophisticated artillery that was mostly used against infantry, by the way, in the bigger picture, that was more dense and more numerous, or the same musketry fire, linear formations would put an end to cavalry mobility, and shock effect, and general effectiveness. We have this gradual increase. We made specific videos about that in the amount of artillery, which also means that this was quite useful in general, but we're mostly talking against fortifications or at most against infantry, massed infantries, because cavalry may have been the upper arm, but they were less numerous at large. In 1377, Milanese inventory, for example, that lists bronze cannons capable of firing 50-pound stones. I made an entire video about the Milanese metallurgical skills as the highest in Europe at the time. This indeed further tilted the balance gradually towards infantry, and in part, you see, even siege warfare, we assume, look at the Trace Italienne, how difficult it was still look in the 17th century to unlock warfare, right? For a battle in open field, even Marlborough fought, other 10 and things like that. So what is that story? That in the Middle Ages, everything was bogged down by castles and, and fortifications. Like, wasn't the 16th or the 17th century basically the same thing? What do we think that actually happened in between? the introduction of the star fortress, how actually, say, given the expansion of this re-expansion of the system after the mid-14th century crisis, how much is it reflective of some kind of increased and, say, fortificatory effect compared to the Middle Ages, as opposed to just the style of this, because there were more concentrated powers that could build more strategically, significant fortifications that basically brought up the many castles before, like, largely into one. But I don't know, is this technically that major divide? You have been sold the notion that this was, but it's also in this case complete BS. You find, again, different other sources, like the Battle of Chioggia in 1380 is a good example, very good example of amphibious warfare with pretty remarkable use of artillery during siege warfare, siege and naval warfare. So we'll have to talk about the Battle of Chioggia because it's one of the most, as you know, famous operations showing that kind of incredible versatility. So already as medieval warfare, it's not like, I don't know, we talked about recently for example, the Third Venetian-Genoese War, were basically just a generation later. These were normal medieval forces just now increasingly provide with guns. And it's not like before they didn't have artillery of some, or simply the guns per se made the entire change. But to this entire notion, there were men-at-arms actually driving the struggle there, both on ships and on land. And so the notion that the traditional knightly tactics were obsolescent in the face of technological innovation in particular is complete garbage. Admittedly, the moral shock of the 14th century crisis altered very much balances that were to be seen into the battlefield. For example, the aforementioned tactics that were, by the way, studied exactly to provide cavalry with this gradual punching capacity, wave after wave, stopped. Why? Because there was an actual force stopping the cavalry? Not really. They stopped mostly because armies became smaller. In that sense, fortification was more important in relative terms, even though people were poor. Yes, the states began to build more robust fortifications even before the star fortresses came around, etc. But it wasn't immediate, right? It was mostly something gradually evolving to something else again. This could be seen also in small unit tactics, for example. So we've seen it in the video, for example, about Molinella and also Caravaggio. There are lots of fortifications there. And armies have come back to more like side deployments, like what those divisions in depth would have been one after the other. In fact, now they were placed like with a center and wings. They are not to be confused with the wings of infantry, for example, that existed before. They were just conceptually not even the battle line, because cavalry had the primacy, also in a broader chivalric sense, but just auxiliary forces. Here instead you have the men-at-arms distributed in these three divisions, but one on the side of the other. But in this sense, the cavalry was still the breaking element. And so it's mostly like an adaptation than any kind of sort of more traumatic end of knightly warfare tactics. Of course, things speeded up, like faster. Like if you look at, I don't know how they fought in the 13th century, just look at 200 years later. Depending on where you looked at, probably certain things looked very similar, other things looked already substantially different. This was especially true 300 years, like 13th century, 16th century, right? Those were also more sudden events. But again, they don't really mirror the end of cavalry. They don't really mirror the end, especially of the establishment that had historically produced cavalry. And this is valid also for the infantry. The infantry more or less has still a subordinated function in political terms commoners are not better off at this point in relative terms, in terms of individual liberty especially, because people were gradually improving their quality of life. And that is interesting as well, because it shows you that it happened within the ancien regime. It didn't happen much in a, let's say, under, I don't know, because this liberty, the lesser liberty deprived them, for example, of greater absolute wealth. And in part, that's also what the magic of the state, to an extent. But this is also a bit of another topic. Now, of course, this is a great topic per se to discuss. We have lots of this kind of videos. As you understand, this is something we did for a very long time and with very great sort of interest, and it's an evergreen for Schwerpunkt. In any case, it's also some sort of different way of seeing things for many that need to be reminded, this kind of things. And in general, it's also talking about specific centuries, but putting them in relation with others. Like, because the art of war is a story, right? It kind of also never ends to some degree. It is really true, and so. But war, in that sense, never changes, right? I suspect that von Clausewitz, the more I study history of religions, the more I suspect that von Clausewitz had a very strikingly concrete awareness of the doctrine of the two natures and traditional knowledge, which is something that he's never been studied for, ridiculously enough, because, of course, any criticism of von Clausewitz seems like the criticism it's like a postmodernist one, as if von Clausewitz is just the modern and not something that was evolving from actually a very traditional background, especially in the case of Prussia, before Napoleon crushed them. So, and triggering, in fact, this new way of thinking that, however heavily drew from traditional principles, if anything, principles that were re-edited and more clearly outlined in a sort of more, in a less mythological fashion, let's put it in this way, but also with the reader of the time, which is also one reason why the von Kriege is actually destined to everybody, right? It doesn't make any... And it would become actually more famous among civilians than among the military. Just for showing also how the military can fall prey of general mistakes, etc., if they become too hyperly, sort of sectorally specialized in their own field without... As von Clausewitz instead prepotently relaunches connected, subordinated to politics, and so also to some other principles indirectly. So Jomini, that, as you know, was von Clausewitz's greater opponent, so to say, ended up saying, you know what, von Clausewitz was right. And that's also what makes Jomini, that was the proponent of the other model, also such a great man, because he had the intellectual dignity of, even though von Clausewitz was dead, like, Jomini could have done whatever. He actually and really gave him his due and more, because at that point, a reason proper. And that's very mature behavior from a person who instead lived very long, as Jomini was a bit of a celebrity for this in his own time, because he survived. Imagine had von Clausewitz survived, had he lived just till the 1860s. And again, it's unfortunately history goes strange directions. It leaves you hints to realize how important the truth is and how much people are struggling towards it when they really understand what their best is. That is incredibly important in so many ways. But anyhow, for today, in any case, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.